Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. Hi there, everybody. Before we begin, please mention where you're from, what time you're watching, and that you like and subscribe to the channel. In this manner, YouTube will continue to play tales similar to this one for you. Let's get started. Errors are not tolerated in the August Arizona desert, and I believed I knew better than to make them at the age of 31. I'd been a freelance photographer in Phoenix for approximately 3 years, and the outdoors had turned into my second office. I would take my camera out on various trails every weekend, expanding my collection of southwestern vistas. The Desert Wanderers group looked ideal when I came upon it on Facebook. Organized hikes with knowledgeable guides to isolated areas that are rarely seen by visitors. I packed my photographic gear, a few protein bars, sunscreen, a lightweight jacket, and what I believed to be enough of water and 3 into my backpack that Saturday morning. Although the group leader, Frank, a seasoned hiker who had been on these routes for decades, had stressed the importance of packing extra water, I reasoned that 3 liters would be more than sufficient for a 5-hour trek. In an attempt to avoid the worst of the heat, we met at a service station off Highway 60 at 5 in the morning. There were 8 of us in all, including intermediate hikers like me and more seasoned hikers. Frank walked us through the route, which was a 12-mile circle through a labyrinth of canyons that would pass several natural springs and ancient petroglyphs. He forced everyone to display their water supply, raising an eyebrow at mine, but, at most, nodding in approval. With a gritty voice from years of desert air, he replied, 3L might be cutting it close, but the petrol station was already closed. But I reassured him that I would be all right, because I had hiked in the desert many times. The first hour was enchanted, with the sunrise painting the rocks in pink and orange hues that my camera struggled to capture. Despite my best efforts with each photo, the party progressed at a steady pace, and I kept pausing to take pictures of the sand's beautiful patterns, the way the light struck the canyon walls, and the lone barrel cactus that stood guard against the rising sky. We arrived at a slender stretch of the trail at 7:30, where enormous rocks produced amazing shadow patterns on the crimson dirt. I needed the shot. Like nature's own art installation, the contrast was flawless and almost unreal. I promised the person closest to me, Diane, a nurse in Scottsdale, that I would catch up in a minute. I knelt down and adjusted my camera settings to catch the play of light and shadow as she nodded and continued walking, her bright blue pack vanishing around a bend. About 50 yards distant, I saw a side track through my lens that led up to what appeared to be a natural arch formation. It had a golden shine that would fade after 20 minutes, since the morning light was striking it at the perfect angle. I scurried up the steep route without giving it much thought, my hiking boots slipping a little on the rough gravel, hoping to capture the ideal photo from my portfolio. The up close, the arch was much more amazing, and I was totally focused on my task for maybe 15 minutes while I was filming from various perspectives. The silence struck me first when I eventually lowered my camera and looked around. There were no sounds of other hikers, talking, or gravelly footsteps. The gang hadn't waited for me, and I became acutely annoyed when I noticed that the major route below appeared deserted in both directions. Since we had been going in that direction, I decided to take a right turn and clambered back down to the main route. I walked quickly for 10 minutes, but I still hadn't caught up. Near a stand of towering saguaro cacti, the route divided into 2 paths, and I paused there, perspiring already, forward in spite of the early hour, trying to recall whether Frank had brought up the subject of a fork. My phone displayed a meaningless emergency calls only notice and no signal. Additionally, since I was meant to be in a group the entire time, I hadn't considered downloading offline maps. Since the left path appeared to be more worn and had more foot traffic, I decided to take it, assuming it was the main trail. However, after 20 more minutes of hiking at an ever-increasing pace, the trail became narrow and began a difficult ascent. Frank had described a pretty flat circle, but this was nothing like it. Half of my first water bottle was already gone. In my haste to catch up, I had been drinking non-stop, and the temperature was rapidly rising. Even though it wasn't yet 9 o'clock, the weather app on my phone, which was one of the few items that functioned offline, indicated that it was already 92. I wasted another 20 minutes in more valuable water by going back to the fork, then attempted the correct route. This one, which wound through a wash with high walls that offered some shade, initially looked more hopeful. However, after a mile or so, it came to a dead stop at a group of enormous rocks that appeared to have fallen lately, most likely during the flash floods that occurred last month. My logical side told me to remain composed, go back to the location where I had shot the pictures, and wait there for the group to realize I was gone and come get me. However, pride and the nascent terror drove me to continue looking, in the hopes of seeing the group, or at least recognizing some landmark from Frank's pre-hike briefing. I ascended a small ridge to gain a better view. Everywhere I looked was a never-ending desert. Miles of cruciate bushes, Ocosio plants straining toward the cloudless sky with their spindly limbs, and far-off mountains glistening in the heat that was already distorting the air in those wavy ways. I was down to a third bottle of water from my second. Additionally, it was 9:47 and showing 101 when I checked my phone once again. My shirt was soaked through with sweat that vanished almost immediately in the dry air, and the weight of my photographic equipment, which is normally almost perceptible, was like carrying stones in my bag. By 11 o'clock, I was halfway through my third and last bottle and had finished my second. My phone indicated that the temperature was 109, and each breath was like taking a breath from a hairdryer. I was now concentrating on basic survival and had given up on finding the route, seeking any kind of shade. However, the ragged desert plants cast shadows that were no larger than dinner plates, and the light was nearly directly overhead. Even though I kept using lip balm, my lips were cracked, and where my hat didn't completely cover the back of my neck, I could already feel the start of what would turn into a serious sunburn. I could make out electrical wires slicing through the desert at a distance of perhaps 2 miles. Additionally, I was aware that electricity lines indicated access roads, which could be helpful, but it felt like an ocean to travel 2 miles in this heat with so little water remaining. Squeezing myself into the strip of shelter it offered, I located a big boulder with a small overhang, in an attempt to fit as small as possible in the shadow. My knees pushed up to my chest. The actual fear started then, the type that tightens your chest and causes your mind to spin. I was aware of the figures. Every summer, people die in the Arizona desert. Hikers with experience, visitors, and residents who ought to be more knowledgeable. The heat kills you slowly. Your organs begin to shut down one by one after you experience confusion and hallucinations. I tried to figure out how long I could last by rationing my last bottle of water into tiny sips, just enough to moisten my mouth. I had switched down everything but emergency services to save power, and my phone's battery was at 40%. Still, there was no signal. Sitting there in just my sports bra, I removed my long-sleeved hiking shirt and wrapped it around my head like a makeshift turban, disregarding modesty in favor of survival. I could literally see the air shimmering and dancing, forming strange mirages that made far-off shrubs appear like pools of water, and the rocks surrounding me radiated heat like an oven. I decided to try for the power lines at around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, when my dying phone indicated that the temperature was 112. No one knew that staying put would definitely result in dehydration. Where I was, I had only mentioned that I was going out with a hiking group, and not even which particular path I would be hiking that day, in case someone happened to look. I left a small notebook I carried for taking notes on photography weighted down with pebbles and arrows, indicating in the direction I was going. I tore pages out of the notebook. I was hopelessly sloshing at the bottom of the bottle with my water down to maybe 3 o'clock, and instead of torturing myself with the sound of it, I had already made the decision to drink it all before beginning the trek. After 5 minutes of leaving my boulder shelter, I could feel the sun piercing every exposed inch of skin like millions of tiny needles, and the ground scorched through my hiking boots. I covered my head and shoulders with my jacket, making a pitiful tent of shade that did very little to combat the attack of heat, both below and above. It could have been 20 miles instead of 2. I had to crouch down to make myself smaller against the light and rest every few hundred yards. I could hear my heart thumping so loudly in my ears. My tongue was heavy and swollen, and my mouth felt like it had been chewing cotton. I couldn't stop having strange thoughts, random recollections of swimming pools, ice cream stores, and the waterfall shower at the spa I went to for my birthday last year. My palms scraped the flaming pebbles as I faltered and fell about halfway to the power lines. I laid there for a while wondering if this was how things would turn out. If some hiker would discover my body months later, mummified by the heat of the desert. But then I heard it, the distant hum of electricity from the power wires, and even better, the faint sound of an engine. I screamed with what little voice I had left, although it sounded more like a croak, and staggered forward, legs trembling, my white jacket flying like a flag over my head. It was a utility truck, one of those white pickups with the flashing yellow lights, and it was moving slowly under the power lines on the access road. Carl, the driver, who appeared to be in his 50s and had heavily tanned arms with faded tattoos, subsequently admitted to me that he nearly failed to stop because he believed I was just another desert phantom. However, he applied the brakes because of the way I was moving, stumbling, and waving that jacket. He leapt from his already grabbing his water cooler from the truck, and I will always remember how it felt to take that first drink of chilly water. It was similar to reviving. It seemed as though all of my body's cells had been yelling before abruptly becoming silent. As he assisted me into his air-conditioned taxi, he poured some over my head and neck, disregarding the fact that it was soaking the seats. He informed me I was lucky since the thermometer on his dashboard read 114 outside. Although there had been complaints of copper thieves in the region, he wasn't expected to inspect this portion until the following week. Carl called ahead on his radio to inform them that he was bringing in someone with heat exhaustion, and he took me directly to the closest urgent care center. As the nurses monitored my kidney function and connected me up to 4 fluids, I lay in a bed with cooling blankets for the next 4 hours, allowing my core temperature to gradually return to normal. By the time Carl located me, Frank and the hiking group had already contacted search and rescue, and realizing was missing when they arrived at the lunch location. An additional hour or 2 in that heat without water may have resulted in organ failure. The doctor, a young lady with training in emergency medicine specialized for desert-related ailments, informed me plainly. My palms still bear the marks from my fall. Tiny, faint memories that are progressively less noticeable every year. I still take desert photos now, but I never go hiking by myself. I have at least 6L of water with me, and I purchased a GPS beacon that updates satellites with my location every 10 minutes. Some may consider that $12 gadget excessive, but they didn't spend 3 hours in the Arizona desert, watching the power wires shimmer in the heat as their bodies gradually shut down, fearing they would die alone. Even though most people believe that October in Montana is too chilly for backpacking, I continued to pursue those unexplored paths after everyone else had left for the season. After 6 years of leading Yellowstone excursions, I was 32 years old, and my go-to medication was isolation. Like all fall treks, the day things went sideways began in the same manner. 40 miles of forest separated me from the closest paved road, along with my tired osprey pack. With the exception of the animals getting ready for winter, The Absaroka Bear-Tooth Wilderness was entirely empty, resembling a huge cemetery made of stone and pine. My strategy appeared to be infallible. Before the severe snowfall, we spent 3 days following Slow Creek up to the plateau, taking pictures of the fall foliage, and perhaps even spotting some elk. There had been more bear activity around the berry patches, according to the ranger at the Cook City station. But to be honest, those warnings had become inconspicuous after years of carrying bear spray and never having to use it. About 11 miles from the trailhead, nestled between two ridges, the location where everything fell apart was where the creek made a lovely scurve through a meadow. Because the ground had already begun to ice, and it was almost impossible to drive tent stakes deep enough to hold against the wind, setting up camp took longer than normal. Only the circle of light from my headlight dancing over the frost-covered grass remained after darkness had engulfed the valley by the time a small orange shelter was finished. Sitting on a fallen log, we ate tepid instant ramen straight from the pot for dinner, while observing the one by one stars appear in that pristine mountain sky. Every exhalation produced these tiny clouds that hovered in the air before dissipating, and the temperature had already fallen below 20. Exhaustion drew me into my sleeping bag at 8:30, which is much earlier than usual, but typical for solitary trips when there is nothing to do after dark. After I had hung my food bag on the burr pole 100 yards from camp, a standard procedure that had become muscle memory. Around 2 in the morning, I was awakened by the breathing. With every exhale, this deep, rhythmic huffing caused the walls of the tent to quiver. Grizzly, the characteristic sound of a huge predator exploring something fresh in its area, immediately came to mind. About 3 feet from where my head was resting on the stuffed sack was using as a pillow, through the thin nylon, came the obvious sound of a huge object moving its weight from one paw to the other. My fingers located the safety tab in the dark. I struggled to calm my own breathing, and the bear spray was sitting right next to my sleeping bag, just where training had taught me to keep it. I had heard the same instruction in every wilderness course I had ever taken. Keep quiet, stay put, allow the bear to become disinterested, and go on. Typically, bears exploring tents were merely trying to pique their interest before searching for real food. However, this one began to circle, and I could feel the vibrations in my chest as each stride went through the frozen earth. Subsequently, the pouring began, initially soft, akin to a dog scratching at a door, to examine the peculiar orange fabric that had surfaced in its domain. As the animal pressed against the tent pole close to my feet, it bent inward, and I heard claws catching on the rainfly, making little tearing noises that made my teeth tighten. Although my headlamp was within reach, turning it on would simply serve to verify that I was inside what would likely appear to a hungry bear getting ready for hibernation to be a gigantic piece of exotic fruit. The careful and deliberate circling went on, broken now and again by these low grunts that sounded almost conversational, as if the bear were talking to itself as it worked through a conundrum. Every instinct told me to flee when it placed its nose on the tent's wall close to my torso, leaving a wet imprint that glistened in the starlight that was seeping through the cloth. Running, however, meant stepping straight into the path of an animal that could cover 30 yards faster than I could blink, as well as unzipping the tent, which would consume valuable seconds. The bear finally reached a point where it hooked its claws through the mesh window by the entrance and tugged, ripping a 6-inch gap that allowed in a blast of cold air and the overpowering stench of rotting meat and damp fur. Nothing compares to the scent of a grizzly up close. God, it's a combination of a dog kennel, a compost waste, and something wild and ancient that sets off all of your evolutionary alarms. I touched the bear spray trigger with my thumb, but nothing happened. I was holding a useless canister and looking at a huge brown snout that was pressing through the hole in my tent, but the mechanism had totally frozen in the sub-zero weather. Even if the safety tab had come off without any problems. At last, panic overcame my conditioning, and my body started moving before my mind could control it. I rolled sideways, snatched at my torch, and dove toward the back of the tent, piercing the fabric across from the bear with my shoulder like a battering ram. Adrenaline kept my legs moving. I ran blindly into the darkness, only the bouncing beam of my flashlight revealing glimmers of rocks and trees. The cold hit like jumping into ice water. I heard the sound of the tent being torn down behind me. In a matter of seconds, my entire camp was demolished, with poles snapping and fabric tearing. The growl of the bear reverberated off the walls of the canyon, something primordial that seemed to come from nowhere, rather than the humorous sounds you hear in movies from the planet itself. I followed the creek downstream, since water meant a clear path, and my bare feet, with no time for boots, found every frozen stick and jagged rock. I crashed into the underbrush. Then perhaps, just possibly, a means to cover up my smell. The beam of the flashlight caught the reflection of eyes behind me, moving with that deceptive casualness that grizzlies have when they're not really trying yet, and they were undoubtedly following, about 40 yards back, in the snow that had begun to fall earlier. The blood from my ripped feet created a flawless trail, with each step turning scarlet before the next. I could touch both sides without extending my arms, since the walls of the tiny ravine where the creek led were so close together. As I clambered across ice-covered rocks, I could hear that the bear is breathing more closely. It was no longer carefree, but deliberate, as if it had determined that the pursuit had lasted long enough. The batteries in my flashlight began to struggle in the cold, causing it to flicker and cast strange shadows that made every rock appear like a potential predator. I found what appeared to be salvation about 50 yards down the slope, a group of enormous rocks forming a little opening that is perhaps 2 feet wide, just broad enough for a desperate human, but too little for a mature grizzly. I had to scrape the flesh off my back and shoulders to wedge myself into that crack, but it placed solid rock between those claws and me. A few seconds later, the bear came, slamming its shoulder into the entrance with such force that it shook dust from the rocks above. The harsh growls that echoed through my hiding place were a clear indication of its discontent, until the first grey light of dawn began to seep over the sky, which lasted for the following 4 hours. That bear made every effort to get to me. It sent gravel showers in my face as it carved away at the base of the cliffs. It scaled to the top and extended its dinner plate-sized paws downward. As I squeezed myself against the back wall, I felt claws scrape inches from my skull. It departed for perhaps 20 minutes, at one point the longest 20 minutes of my life, and then came back to continue its assault. The chill had shifted, beyond excruciating, into a strange numbness that made it difficult to feel my feet, and intense shaking made it difficult to steady the lamp. Seductively, hypothermia said that it would be simple to simply close my eyes and go to sleep. However, I was constantly startled back to reality by the sporadic swipe of claws. As the visibility improved around 5 in the morning, the bear appeared to lose interest. Its sounds grew farther away until they were completely gone. I waited an additional hour before scuttling out of the crevice, though, after being stuck in the same pasture for so long, every joint is screaming in protest, on ruined feet that were black and purple from frostbite. It took 3 hours to make the trip back to what was left of my camp. Bloody footprints were left in the fresh snow that had covered the turmoil, and every step felt like walking on broken glass. From the evening, it appeared as though a bomb had detonated at the campsite. Shredded sleeping bags strewn over 50 yards. Poles of tents twisted into unfeasible angles. Clothing and freeze-dried food were all over my ripped-open backpack. My water filter was even discovered by the bear, who turned it into plastic confetti. However, my satellite emergency beacon, which was concealed in a side pocket that the bear had overlooked, continued to function. After years of pride in my ability to survive on my own in the bush, pressing that SOS button felt like a defeated mission. But when you see toes that may need to be amputated, pride is nothing. I collected what was left of my equipment and waited for a help. I found something that made my chest tighten as I pressed ripped clothes on my feet to stem the bleeding. The bear had been stalking my camp 4 hours before I woke up, as evidenced by the enormous paw tracks that circled the entire meadow. It was only in the afternoon when the helicopter came. When the search and rescue crew noticed my feet's state and the destruction all around us, Their expressions changed from one of professional serenity to one of sincere worrying. The paramedic tending to my wounds on the flight to the Billings hospital said they had been tracking a male bear that was violent and had lost his fear of people due to too many confrontations with reckless campers who failed to properly store their food. I didn't miss the irony. Even though I had done everything correctly, hung my food according to my training, and followed all the procedures, I nevertheless became just another bear encounter statistic. The hospital doctor confirmed that 2 of my toes would require partial amputation due to frostbite and noted 43 distinct cuts on my feet, some of which were deep enough to require stitches. Skin grafts and physical rehabilitation took 2 months to recover, but the emotional healing process took much longer. 5 years later, I still have dreams about sleeping in a tent. I wake up breathless, certain that I can hear that unique breathing right outside. The ensuing investigation turned up information that still sickens me to this day. The bear had seen me set up, prepare dinner, and climb into my tent as if I were putting myself in a wrapped gift box. Since rangers discovered its day bedding fewer than 200 yards from where I had slept, it had come and gone from my tent at least 4 times before committing to the inquiry that roused me. According to the trace, 3 weeks later, the bear charged a group of hunters close to Cook City, and the necropsy showed something unsettling, so they finally had to put it down. Although no remains were ever discovered, its stomach held equipment and human clothes from at least 2 additional camps. After years of successfully attacking supplies that were incorrectly stored, the bear had learnt to identify human encampments with easy food rewards, the scientists claimed, and had started to view tents as food containers that needed to be opened. Apparently, it was sheer chance that spared me 4 miles. The only thing that could have offered sufficient cover from a determined grizzly was the ravine I'd fallen into while racing blind. I still lead tour in Yellowstone now, but my approach to navigating untamed areas has fundamentally changed. I pause every time a twig snaps. I keep 2 cans of bear spray with me, along with a backup that I maintain at body temperature to avoid freezing, because every shadow could be dangerous. I tell them the story when they inquire about my noticeable limp or the reason I wear special boots to suit my modified feet, and I observe as their expressions change from one of delight at seeing wildlife to one of realization of the realities of coexisting with apex predators. There is no wickedness or malice in the wilderness. That bear was only acting in accordance with its developed instincts for thousands of years. However, it is also not our buddy, not a Disney film where safety is ensured by decency and appropriate food storage. Even if you do everything correctly, there are instances when you wind up jammed between rocks in the snow, bleeding, while 700 pounds of muscle and claws try to pull you out. They don't provide that fact in the camping guides. Bear spray, experience, and training are all irrelevant to nature. Entering those mountains signifies your acceptance of that agreement. You are entering a place that is both beautiful and horrible, and it may decide to remind you of your true position in the food chain. That November, college was killing me, so I seized the opportunity when my roommate Jason proposed that we forego our Friday classes in favor of a hike close to the Cascade foothills. 22 very anxious before the finals, more than I wanted another lecture on European history. I needed to clear my thoughts. We packed camping equipment we didn't plan to use in his beat-up Ford Ranger. Around morning, I picked up some bottled water and energy bars from the campus store and left. We drove 3 hours north through tiny logging communities with only 2 pumps at the petrol stations and cafes still panelled with wood. As I watched the city fade into mountain ash and Douglas firs, Jason continued to play the same indie rock playlist that had captured his attention since his sophomore year. We chose a parking location that was simply a broad area where the forestry road transitioned to gravel. Our car was the only one there when we pulled in at about 9 that morning, but there might have been space for 4 or 5. The trail began behind a worn wooden sign that announced Ridgeline Trail number 7, with the carved letters barely visible. Jason picked up his backpack, I slipped on the fleece jacket my mom had sent me the month before and tightened the laces on my boots. The pine needles had become bronze, the walkway was narrow, and the recent rain had made it slick, and it turned back through trees so dense that, despite the absence of the sun, everything remained cold and dark beneath the canopy. After maybe 40 minutes of walking, Jason told me about a lady from his economics class who kept messaging him at 2 in the morning. About 20 feet ahead, we passed a group of moss-covered stones and noticed something white fluttering against a massive cedar tree. I initially assumed it was trash, possibly toilet paper, that a hiker had left behind. However, as we approached, I noticed that it was a paper mask, one of those little Halloween masks you can purchase at a dollar store, that was affixed to the bark using what appeared to be a hunting knife. A folded piece of notebook paper was pierced through the same knife behind the mask, which had eye holes cut out and a spooky smile painted on it with a black marker. Before I could warn Jason that perhaps we shouldn't touch the message, he went for it and pulled the paper away, leaving the knife pierced through the tree trunk. We both leaned in to read the message, which was scrawled in the same black marker at the mask smile. When he unfolded it, "Greetings from the game. Find the next mask and take it. The fallen oak bridge is 50 paces north. Now is the beginning of your time." In fact, Jason chuckled. When he pretended not to be frightened during horror films, he would giggle nervously and say that it was most likely a geo-caching activity or perhaps a scavenger hunt organized by the local college students. He was already starting to show the competitive aspect that made him so annoying on board game nights. He pulled the knife from the tree, took the mask, and began counting steps north before I could advise that we simply leave it alone. What else was I going to do but follow, go out there and leave him alone? However, there was something about the entire arrangement that made my chest feel constricted, and it had nothing to do with the altitude or going trekking. We eventually arrived at a huge oak tree that must have fallen during a storm years ago, after taking 50 steps through the underbrush. Its trunk acts as nature's own bridge across a tiny gulf. Another paper mask was there, on the opposite side, fastened with orange surveyor's tape on a branch. This one has red ink written on a frown and triangle eyes. This one came with a letter that read, "Well done, you're picking things up quickly." At the clearing where 3 trails converge, the next mask is located. Behind the large stump, take the deer route. Now Jason was getting into it, reaching across the log to retrieve the second mask and placing the first in his backpack. Discussing how intricate the entire event was and speculating about the potential final award. However, while I searched the forest for the deer route specified in the note, I came upon something that had my entire body tense up around 30 yards to our left, partially obscured by a stand of young hemlocks. A person wearing camouflage clothing was observing us from a perfectly steady position. I forced Jason to drop the second mask by firmly grasping his arm, and I just gestured with my chin in the direction of the person's position when he began to complain. When we looked straight at the figure, they remained still, didn't shout, wave, or act any actions taken by regular people when they are discovered on a trail. Wore full hunting camouflage, including one of those face masks that hide everything but the eyes, and just remain there like a statue. It was probably just a hunter, Jason muttered, perhaps bow season or something. However, hunters do more than only gaze at humans. Additionally, this individual was standing with their arms at their sides in a manner that seemed utterly out of character, and they had no weapons in sight. Both of us remained there for what seemed like an eternity, although it was really only 10 or 15 seconds before Jason said, "Hey there," and waved when the figure didn't come back. I became aware of the odor at that point. The typical forest smell of dirt and rotting leaves was broken up by this strong metallic odor, and I understood it was coming from the direction the game intended us to walk, which was someplace beyond the downed oak tree. Jason must have scented it too, since he reacted completely differently, losing his arrogant attitude as he stepped back, almost tripping on the damp leaves. At last, the camouflaged figure went parallel to our position rather than toward us, moving slowly and deliberately through the trees without making any of the noises you might anticipate from someone moving through underbrush. They paused once more, perhaps 20 yards distant, and continued to observe. We were essentially placed between them when we noticed the second individual, who was also wearing the same outfit, standing on the other side of the route from where we had come. Jason took hold of my shoulder and said that we had to return to the truck immediately. Ignore the pointless game. A primal part of your brain tells you that running starts the chase. So we both turned to go back the way we came, trying to walk quickly without actually sprinting. However, we spotted a third figure in camouflage as we passed the cedar tree where we had discovered the first mask. This person was just in front of us on the route, carrying what appeared to be another of those paper masks in their gloved hands. As soon as we left the track, we both gave up on maintaining our composure and crashed through salal bushes and devil's club that ripped at our clothing and skin. Somewhere during those initial anxious minutes, Jason dropped his backpack, and as we fell over roots and dived under low-hanging branches, I could hear him heaving these frantic breaths that matched mine. The quiet behind us was the worst. While those figures were likely gliding through the trees like smoke, knowing exactly where we were going, there was only our own loud flight through the forest. No shouting, no sounds of pursuit. All we could think about was the vehicle, to sell service and people, get to the truck, lock the doors, and drive until we find pavement. Regular folks who didn't engage in deranged activities in the forest. After what seemed like hours of sprinting, but was actually only 20 minutes, we exploded out of the forest line and into the tiny parking space. Additionally, the Ford Ranger was parked just where we had left it, appearing to be the most gorgeous sight I had ever seen. Before we even got to it, Jason was hunting for his keys. He dropped his hands twice on the gravel because they were shaking so much. However, we both came to a complete halt when we were within 10 feet of the truck, because there were footprints all over the surrounding area. The car was repeatedly circled by dozens and dozens of boot prints in the soft mud, as if someone had been strolling around while we were away. At least 7 or 8 times, if not more, the prints circled. Additionally, there were spots where you could see the person who had done so had halted and remained motionless. Deeper down, the impressions seemed to have been monitoring the trail, anticipating our return. Jason created, I thought he might shatter the driver's side door when he made this sound, which was almost a sob, but not quite, and virtually lunged for it, slamming the key in the lock. There was no damage to the doors. The windows were still in place. Other than those prints and one other item, nothing appeared to have been touched. Another paper mask was hidden beneath the windshield wiper. This one has no lips at all, and eyes that are hollow black circles. Where a mouth should be, there's just flat white paper. "You didn't finish the game" was also scribbled on the forehead using the same black marker. Jason flung the mask on the ground after tearing it off the windshield. The scream reverberated off the trees as we both jumped into the truck and shut the door. For a terrible moment, the engine simply clicked as he turned the key. The sound of a dead battery that causes your spirit to depart from your body. On the second attempt, however, it roared to life, and we were on the road. Jason reversed quickly and almost struck a tree, sending gravel flying everywhere. All 3 people appeared at various spots along the woodland edge. We turned to face the exit, standing in the same strange silence, watching us go. Without making a wave, one of them held up their palm as if to show us something. Additionally, even from within the truck, there was another folded piece of paper, as I could see. Jason took the curves far too quickly and smashed it down the wooded road. While I continued to look back, expecting to see cars following us, the truck was fishtailing on the loose gravel. However, there was nothing except dust and an empty road. It took us 40 minutes to reach the major highway before we slowed down or stopped. Even then, while I dialed 911 on my at last functional phone, Jason continued to obsessively check the mirrors. With his thick mustache and doubtful attitude, the sheriff's deputy, who met us at a gas station in the closest town, resembled every small-town police officer I've ever seen. And from the first minute of our story, I could tell that he believed we were full of. He made notes regarding the camouflaged individuals and the masks, looked at our students with his eyes, and repeatedly asked if we had been drinking or taking anything. Even after he stated he would have someone check the trail, flashlight, despite the fact that it was only the afternoon. The deputy mentioned that bow season brings out a variety of hunters, and that city. Youngsters frequently mistake typical forest behavior when Jason insisted that they get up there immediately, since those individuals might still be there. He offered us his card, advised us to go home and rest, and instructed us to contact if anything else came up. It took an eternity to drive back to campus. We didn't say anything, but watched every automobile, but approached too closely and listened to the engine. Jason immediately went to his room. We arrived at our apartment and stayed there the entire weekend. Jason eventually told me the following Thursday that he had been researching the area online and had come across old news stories about hikers going missing there over the years, but nothing that seemed to be related to what we had gone through. He showed me this blog post from 3 years ago about someone going on a solitary trek and seeing paper masks on trees. The article ended abruptly, and the account was never updated again. When our friends began making jokes about us being frightened by hunters and accusing us of being paranoid any time we turned down invites to camp, we made the decision to never discuss it with anybody else again. Here's what, though, still causes me to avoid trekking entirely and lock my doors twice every night. A month or so after that excursion, just before winter break, I discovered something tucked beneath my wiper as I was making my way to my car in the college parking garage. The notebook paper was folded, just like the ones found in the forest. "Games don't end just because you stop playing," was written in a single line using the same black marker. I changed my phone number, moved apartments the following week, and even transferred to a new school the following semester, all while convincing everyone that it was for a better program. I now reside in a different state, and that was 4 years ago. Work at a workplace where poor coffee and paper cuts are the major threats. However, I still occasionally get the impression that someone was in my apartment while I was at work. Nothing was taken or relocated. I had the impression that someone was waiting and breathing my air while standing in my space. I no longer communicate with Jason. That March, he left school. He was living with his parents and working in construction when I last heard from him. However, I received an email with simply an attachment and no subject line from an unfamiliar address about 6 months ago. Against my better judgment, I opened it to see a picture of a tree with a paper mask pinned to it, the same missing mouth and empty eyes. Additionally, the apartment building I had just moved into 3 weeks prior was visible in the backdrop, albeit indistinct. What might I say to the police that wouldn't sound crazy? In any case, what crime had been committed? I now just deal with it, changing locks that probably don't matter, staying away from forests I used to adore, and wondering if I'll ever come home to see footprints around my car again or, worse, finally meet the person who has been playing this game for a lot longer than that November morning. Ever since I had relocated to Colorado after college, the state's mountains had been beckoning me. When I woke up in my tiny Boulder apartment that early in February, I checked the weather reports again before leaving. Forecasters said a storm system was approaching from the west, but it wouldn't make landfall until late in the evening. I have plenty of time to climb Gray's Peak and descend again. The previous evening, I received a text from my brother Kevin, who was concerned that I would be going alone once more. However, I had already completed this route at least a dozen times under different circumstances. In winter climbing, it's not enough to simply know the mountain. You also need to respect it enough to back off when things get out of hand. As I sipped my black coffee and checked my equipment one last time that morning, I was unaware that the weather models had been inaccurate by roughly 6 hours. Just yesterday was my 29th birthday week, and Kevin continued making jokes about me needing to take responsibility for my actions. However, I felt most alive in the mountains. By the time I arrived at the trailhead at approximately 7 in the morning, my pickup truck was the only vehicle parked there. My dashboard's temperature indicator indicated -12°F. However, I felt ready with my layers, insulated middle, merino wool foundation, and my go-to red shell jacket. I had everything I needed in my rucksack. I have extra batteries for my avalanche beacon, emergency bivvy, energy snacks, 2 liters of water and insulated bottles, and my GPS. As a backup, I had even included chemical hand warmers. The initial 2 miles proceeded without incident, with my crampons digging into the dense snow as I took the path of the summer trail. The winter blue in the sky above gave the impression that everything will be all right. However, I saw that the wind was increasing sooner than I had anticipated, which caused little snow devils to spin across the exposed path portions. I arrived at the tree line, where the actual climb starts, at around 9:30. Every time I inhaled, ice crystals formed on my beard, and the temperature had plummeted even further. According to my GPS, I was on track to reach the summit in around 3 miles with another fort. I didn't give it much thought, even though the device had been acting slow in the cold and taking longer to refresh my location. In any case, I knew every turn back and false top of this path by heart. The snow on the ridge ahead was unspoiled and sparkling in the dawn light like crushed diamonds. I took a break to eat an energy bar and sip water, being careful to keep the bottles inside my jacket to prevent them from freezing in between sips. At that moment, I became aware of the dark, heavy clouds that were moving more quickly than they should have on the western horizon. Those clouds spoke a different story than the forecast apps on my phone, which still indicated that the storm would arrive at around 8 that evening. Around 11 o'clock, the sky had entirely changed by the time I arrived at the last approach to the summit ridge. The once clear blue had turned to a menacing grey, and the wind had changed from being bothersome to actually dangerous, gusting so strongly that it could knock me sideways if I wasn't cautious. After flickering once and twice, my GPS screen went entirely dark. Even though the extra batteries were warming in my chest pocket, the cold had destroyed it. My phone's battery meter indicated only 15% when I took it out to use as a backup navigation device. It was being drained by the cold more quickly than I had ever witnessed. Near the top, I was able to send Kevin a brief note. Just as the screen went dark, the message appeared to have been conveyed. I had no phone or GPS, and the clouds were consuming the valley below me like a wall of static on an ancient television. Although it would take at least 3 hours to descend in ideal conditions, I might be able to reach the summit in 30 minutes. These were also not going to be favorable circumstances over a longer period of time. Turning around at that moment and using the remaining visibility to go below the tree line before the storm came would have been the wise course of action. However, the thought of that communication to Kevin, nearly at the summit, and my actual proximity to him kept coming to mind. On a mountain, pride is a hazardous thing. I made the decision to go for the summit, assuring myself that I would simply tag it fast and immediately descend down. The first snowflakes began pelting my goggles like tiny needles, and the wind was howling now, likely at 40 miles per hour with heavier gusts. Those few flakes turned into a total whiteout in 10 minutes. The wind-driven snow had already begun to fill in my footsteps from the way up, and I could only see 15 feet in any direction. Suddenly, out of the white emptiness, the summit Chiron emerged, nothing more significant than the fact that I had succeeded. A mound of frozen rocks. No selfies, no celebration, just the instant recognition that I had committed a potentially lethal error. The descent began poorly and quickly worse. I had to navigate using terrain features as I didn't have GPS. However, every snow-covered rock seems the same during a whiteout. I knew I had to turn down the eastern face after following the ridge northeast for approximately a quarter of a mile. However, after walking for 5 minutes, I was unsure if I had covered 50 or 500 feet. I couldn't even hear my own breathing since the wind was so loud. Just this roar, which seemed to come from everywhere at once and never stopped. Every few feet I took, I had to clear my goggles, because they were fogging and freezing over. I became aware that my fingers weren't functioning properly at that point. Even with my insulated gloves on, the first signs of frostbite were appearing. My body was beginning to shut down the extremities to maintain core heat, since I had been out in the cold for too long and was moving too slowly. Every mountaineer is aware that you're on borrowed time once frostbite sets in, so I decided to dig in and stop moving. Wandering blind off a cliff or into an avalanche zone was the alternative. With my remaining power and my ice axe, I made a tiny indentation in the side of what felt like a huge boulder. Though the storm made it impossible for me to see it clearly, wearing crampons in that wind was like attempting to fold myself into an envelope during a hurricane. And it took me 3 tries to open the emergency bivy sack from my pack with my clumsy fingers. I took out the chemical hand warmers I had brought, cracked them open, and jammed them into my boots and gloves. Although I knew it was just temporary, the relief was instantaneous. They would be gone in a few hours. It was just afternoon, according to the watch. I might have an opportunity if the storm cleared by nightfall as predicted. The math grew both lots simpler and considerably worse if it continued through the night. You do not want to consider the survival rates for a nighttime exposure of 14,000 feet in a blizzard when you are experiencing them. With the wind howling inches from my face inside the bivy sack, I had time to think things over. At the latest, search and rescue would not begin their search until tomorrow. If I didn't check in, Kevin would think I was holed up somewhere secure for the night. In any case, these kinds of conditions are not where the mountain rescue teams deploy. It would just increase the number of casualties. My options had shrunk to 2 equally bad possibilities. I could either try to descend blind through terrain that killed experienced climbers even in good weather, or I could stay put and hope I could survive for 18 to 20 hours in sub-zero conditions with little shelter. Numerous cliff bands on the eastern slope necessitated precise vision and cautious route finding. I would fall 100 feet if I made one wrong turn. However, being still meant battling hypothermia all night long. With only a flimsy bivy sack between me from the heart-stopping cold, it was already beginning to seep in. Your body is deceiving to you as it shuts down, giving you that sleepy feeling that isn't actually warmth. Then I recalled something from a course I had taken years before about avalanche. The instructor is discussing how to navigate the terrain during whiteouts. He had talked about following fall lines and how gravity and water always tell you which way is down. I might be able to descend without falling off a cliff if I could locate the slope's natural drainage and carefully follow it, checking each step with my ice axe. It was still dangerous as hell. However, it provided me with more than just aimless roaming. The wind tried to tear the bivy sack from my frozen hands as soon as I pushed myself out of it and put it back in my pack. Enough had been done by the hand warmers that even though I was no longer able to feel my toes, I could still hold my ice axe correctly. I began feeling through the snow in front of me, searching for the faint dip that would mark the slope's natural fall line. Every step turned become a custom. Move my weight forward, assess the snow's stability, probe with the axe, and repeat. In that white emptiness, time became meaningless. I could have spent 2 hours or 20 minutes moving. When my ice axe abruptly discovered nothing but air, the first cliff band made its appearance. I had been moving ahead in my deliberate cadence when the axe suddenly fell, almost dragging me along with it. Heart, I jerked back, hammering and firmly seated themselves in the snow. I knew there was a route north of this cliff, perhaps 200 yards along the ridge, in clear weather. In a whiteout, however, 200 yards might as well be 200 meters. Using the drop on my right as my sole point of reference in the featureless white, I began to go left. I believed I heard it through the wind at that moment. From above me came a sound that sounded like thunder yet was oddly incorrect at 14,000 feet in a blizzard. It took a moment for my brain to comprehend the meaning of that sound. Avalanche, Tons of snow had broken loose somewhere up the slope and were moving down. I couldn't see which way to flee or where it was coming from during a whiteout. Training took over before conscious awareness. In order to make myself as small and secured as possible, I drove my ice axe deep into the snow, wrapped the rope around my wrist, dropped flat, and dug my crampons in. The ground began to vibrate beneath me as the rumbling intensified, and then there was a change in air pressure. That characteristic whoosh of displaced air just before impact. I was struck from the left by the avalanche, the edge of the slide, not the enormous wall of snow I had expected. Chunks of ice and a jet of powder hit me like a frozen waterfall. I was unable to see, breathe, or do anything but cling on that axe as the mountain attempted to rip me free for perhaps 10 seconds. I was buried up to my waist when it passed, yet I was still tethered and alive. My goggles were gone, and my pack was half ripped off, dangling by one strap. In fact, I had benefited from the avalanche. The slope's loose snow had been scoured away, exposing older, more compacted snow underneath that revealed the true contours of the land. For the first time in hours, I had reference points as I could see darker outlines through the still driving snow that had to be rock outcroppings. The remainder of the descent was a haze of minor triumphs and controlled horror. I was able to avoid 2 additional cliff bands by using those exposed rocks as guides, but the second one required a treacherous walk across a 45 slope that creaked menacingly under my weight. My feet were scorching instead of numb. Ironically, it was encouraging that blood flow was resuming, even though I knew I would suffer frostbite and lose at least a few toes. I practically stumbled into the tree iron at about 3 in the afternoon, based on my watch. Inside my frozen face mask, I sobbed in relief when a twisted pine tree suddenly appeared. Although I was still far from safe, the trees kept me below 12,000 feet and out of the death zone. As I made my way through the forest, following the drainage that I knew would eventually lead to the trail, the storm persisted for an additional 4 hours. It was dark when I arrived at my truck, and my headlight was just barely able to shine through the snow that was still falling. I had to scrape ice off the inside of the windshield before I could drive after the engine took 3 attempts to start. I couldn't use my phone since my fingers were too damaged. I drove directly to Georgetown's emergency room and staggered through the doors, looking like a character from a horror film, with bloodshot, ice-covered eyes and swollen, frostbitten lips that made it difficult for me to talk. The last count for that day, along with the tip of my ring finger. I lost 2 toes on my right foot and 3 on my left due to frostbite. The physician said I was fortunate. If it weren't for my life, I would have completely lost both of my feet after another hour out there. That night, Kevin drove down from Denver, and I will always remember the expression on his face as he entered the hospital room. Only a sibling can handle this mix of relief and rage. Although he didn't have to, he didn't remark, "I told you so." 2 more climbers were killed on separate summits that same day by the 36-hour storm, which also dumped 4 feet of snow. They wouldn't have even begun searching for me until day 3, according to the search and rescue coordinator who came to see me later, and they would have been searching for a body by then. The pain and irreversible damage to my feet that put a stop to my serious climbing days are not the things that bother me the most. It's the realization that every choice I made that day was incorrect, that my confidence and experience had turned into conceit, and that the mountain had taught me a lesson I barely made it through. I no longer climb, but I still live in Colorado and gaze out my apartment window every morning at those peaks. Not as it was. I occasionally go on short, summer hikes on clearly designated paths, always in a group, and I always head back as soon as the weather starts to change. I'm asked if I missed it. The challenges of winter and true mountaineering make sense. In all honesty, I do miss it every day. However, I also recall the taste of my own death in that blizzard. In the cold, my body betrayed me, and the awful chance of living when others perished. The mountains continue to be stunning and alluring. However, I now understand the true nature of that call. It's a warning, not an invitation. When it gets cold, my frostbite scars hurt. damaged nerve endings, and missing tissue are wrong reminders. You remember certain lessons. You carry others within your body. I carry this one in both. Body. I carry this one in both. Until it happens, every parent believes they are ready for the worst, and my perspective on the wilderness was completely altered by that Saturday in early June. I had been granted a long weekend off by my Eugene accounting business. As a wilderness guide in college, I'd also been leading groups into the backcountry of Oregon. So I knew these routes better than most people know their own neighborhoods. That spring, my 14-year-old son Nathan had been pleading with me to take him and his friends on a true backpacking trip instead of simply the day walks we typically took around town. Before high school began in the fall, the boys were meant to celebrate finishing 8th grade the week before. Bradley and Josh, Nathan's mates, were decent youngsters I'd known since together. They attended elementary school. I was trusted by both families to sign the permission sheets without questioning them about the overnight camping portion. We had selected a moderate 15-mile route in the Cascade Range that I was well versed in, one that would test the lads without posing any serious risks. Josh was quieter and more perceptive, always pointing out interesting plants or rock formations and asking me questions about the ecosystem, while Bradley was the group's joker, always making the other to laugh with his impressions of their teachers and absurd commentary about everything we passed on the trail. Between his pals, Nathan tried to be responsible and mature because his father was around, but he still burst out laughing whenever Bradley did anything especially ridiculous. With bright skies and lows in the 70s, the weather forecast had been ideal. Additionally, we had made terrific progress that morning, traveling roughly 6 miles before lunch at a creek crossing at midday. The boys were having a great time discussing their summer plans. When they returned home on Sunday night, they were fighting about which video game to play first with the girls they had affections on. Because of the late spring snow melt, the creek where we stopped was running higher than normal, over flawless granite rocks polished by centuries of flow. Crystal clear water rushes. Bradley was trying to balance on a fallen log that stretched halfway over the stream, but Josh had already completed his lunch and was crouching by the water's edge, filling his bottle. When Bradley said he needed to refill his water bottle, Nathan was assisting me in gathering the trash from lunch, putting granola bar wrappers in the special trash bag we'd pack out. Their parents had purchased those upscale filtered bottles especially for this vacation, and all 3 boys had them. The type 1 had demanded that we keep to rushing streams for safety, but it was claimed to be able to purify any water source. Josh got up from the edge of the water and moved back toward the trees, but none of us really noticed because the creek was so loud that we had to speak a little louder. When I conducted a quick head count and came up short, Bradley was still playing around on his log, acting like a tightrope walker and making Nathan giggle. Josh had been squatting by the creek, but the area was deserted save for his water bottle cap, which was resting on a rock. The first thing that sprang to mind was that he had, as was quite common, gone behind a tree to take a leak. I shouted out his name, that nonchalant manner that parents do when they aren't yet too concerned. There was only a continuous surge and no response. Bradley asked what was wrong. He saw water spilling over rocks. While Bradley got off his log and hurried up to where Josh had been, Nathan noticed the difference in my voice right away and began searching the treine. The surrounding forest was dense with hemlocks and Douglas firs. Even in the midday heat, their trunks cast a labyrinth of shadows, yet most directions still had good sight for around 30 yards. Over the course of the following 10 minutes, as we dispersed in all places and yelled Josh's name more loudly and urgently, the situation changed from mild concern to actual worrying. About 20 feet from where Josh had been filling his water bottle, Bradley discovered the first tracks. As we returned to the main trail from which we had come, we could clearly see boot prints in the soft mud. Josh's prints were unmistakably his, and they matched the unique waffle design of his new hiking boots that his mother had given him. Purchased him especially for this journey, in anticipation of finding Josh around every corner, perhaps sitting on a rock, checking his phone, or snapping photos of anything intriguing he had discovered. The three of us followed them together, moving swiftly but cautiously. Even though we hadn't seen anybody else on the trail all morning, the tracks continued, swerving between trees in a strangely deliberate manner, as if he had been pursuing something or someone. The footsteps just stopped around 200 yards from the creek, at the same spot where the trail wound around a huge moss-covered boulder, as though Josh had been hoisted straight into the air. While Bradley insisted that this had to be some kind of elaborate prank, and that Josh was most likely hidden behind a tree, waiting to jump out and scare us, Nathan was the first to start acting truly panicked, his voice shaking as he repeatedly cried out for Josh. Josh wasn't that kind of child, though, and I knew it. In all the years I had known him, he had never been, and every hair on my arm stood on end at the way those tracks ended. Even though I knew it was improbable, I took out my phone to see if I could get a signal so I could contact for assistance. However, the screen displayed precisely what I had anticipated. Not a single bar, no service. My phone's GPS was also performing strangely, displaying our location irregularly and occasionally putting us miles away from where we were in reality. When I took it out of my pack, my old compass, the one my father had given me when I first started trekking 20 years ago, was idly spinning in circles. The needle is not settling in any direction, including magnetic north. The sun in the afternoon was when I decided to search in a grid pattern, keeping Nathan and Bradley in constant sight as we painstakingly covered the area surrounding where the tracks disappeared. They were already beginning to angle through the trees. I would blast the emergency whistle on my bag every few minutes. 3 quick blasts, then 3 lengthy ones. At the beginning of our journey, I taught the 3 boys the worldwide distress signal. Bradley had stopped talking. No more attempts to lighten the mood or crack jokes. Josh's name is being called mechanically every 30 seconds, as if the recorder were faulty. Nathan remained near me, so near that I could hear his breathing becoming more labored by the minute, and I continued to calm him by placing my hand on his shoulder, even though I didn't feel really reassured, by checking beneath fallen logs inside the hollow base of an old-growth cedar, and even peering up into the canopy in case Josh had somehow decided to climb a tree, which made absolutely no sense. We must have surveyed -1 square foot of woodland within a 4-mile radius. We heard it at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right as I was about to make the tough choice to go back to the trailhead and seek expert assistance. 3 long whistles, then 3 little ones. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the forest, exactly like the pattern I'd shown that morning. Bradley began yelling Josh's name so loudly that his voice broke and went hoarse, while Nathan grasped my arm so firmly that he left bruises on it. His eyes were big with a mixture of fear and hope. Perhaps 300 yards further, the whistles resurfaced, but the auditory, it was unable to determine the precise direction due to the forest's characteristics. No longer concerned with keeping to the trail or remaining silent, we smashed through the undergrowth toward the sound. As we pushed through dense salal and rhododendron portions, branches scratched our cheeks and arms. However, the whistles would always come from somewhere else, often behind us, just when we thought we were getting close, occasionally to our left or right, but always following the flawless pattern I had taught them. 3 long, 3 short, and 3 short. In early June, darkness arrived sooner than it should have. We were chasing those whistles like they were tugging on invisible strings, deep under the canopy, so perhaps that's why it felt that way. At last I had to call it quits on the sounds and concentrate on our own safety. Nathan was stumbling with tiredness, and Bradley had gone utterly silent. Save for a few whimpers he probably didn't even realize he was making, even though it seemed like giving up on Josh, like leaving him behind when he might be just past the next group of trees. Although none of us intended to sleep, I set up our makeshift shelter in a small area using a simple tarp arrangement to keep the dew off of us. In less than an hour, the temperature dropped more quickly than expected, from comfortable to the point where we needed our fleece coats. I gave out the additional food I had brought, but no one seemed hungry. Those whistles persisted throughout it all, occasionally sounding as far away as miles. As other moments, so near Josh should have been standing directly next us, it felt. However, we never noticed anything, not even a shadow shifting from tree to tree. Those whistles, which my watch indicated arrived precisely every 17 minutes and never varied by more than a few seconds, were the measure of the longest night of my life. The same mechanical accuracy that tightened my chest in fear every time. Around midnight, Bradley finally broke down, crying into his hands as he described how Josh's parents will always despise him. How his suggestion of this foolish vacation in the first place was entirely his fault. Nathan, meantime, sat close to me, shivering but attempting to appear brave in that tragic manner children do when they are afraid, but don't want to express it. I told myself I was searching for Josh, but I really just needed to be sure nothing was coming our way from the shadows, so I kept the flashlight beam moving back and forth across the clearing. After only 2 brief blasts, the whistle stopped in the middle of its pattern at around 3 in the morning. The ensuing calm seemed strangely worse than the previous sounds, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The boys sat huddled together, neither of them speaking nor looking at me, and I started dismantling our improvised camp as soon as the first light arrived. It was such a relief that I felt my muscles relax for the first time in hours. Both boys were so tired and eager to get out of those woods and back to civilization that they virtually jogged the 2-hour journey back to the trailhead, which felt like days. The tiny gravel parking lot was still empty, save for my pickup, which was covered in morning dew and pine needles, as if it had been there 4 weeks, rather than just one night. I went directly to the town's ranger station via car, without even halfway there. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles became white, and I stopped when Bradley vomited about the window. The Rangers mobilized more quickly than I had anticipated, bringing in a county search and rescue team, dogs, and even a helicopter that would arrive within an hour. They separated us for individual statements, but one ranger stayed with the boys and provided them with blankets and hot chocolate, despite the fact that it was no longer cold. After the search teams had deployed, I was brought aside by the lead ranger, Teresa, who had likely seen more lost hikers than she could count. She showed me something on her computer that left me feeling completely numb. The motion-activated wildlife cameras they had placed along the main trail verified the trail recorded data, which indicated that no additional hiking permits had been granted for that area of forest in the previous 4 days. Other than our group, no one else has gone in or out of that location. About 50 feet from where we had lunch, they discovered Josh sitting peacefully on a log 8 hours later. His clothing were clean, his water bottle was full, and he had no recollection of anything other than kneeling by the creek to fill it up. The medical evaluation revealed a blank space where the previous 20 hours should have been, but no physical or mental issues. When they questioned him about the whistles, he appeared perplexed and claimed he was fixing his bootlace when I showed him the emergency signal that morning, which his parents verified was exactly what Josh would do, always preoccupied at important times. Rangers and even some federal forestry officials searched every inch of that trail for 2 more weeks, but they were never able to uncover any clues as to what had transpired that day. The only thing Josh's parents were thankful for was his safe return. I offered to pay for therapy sessions, but they graciously rejected, saying they would deal with it as a family. I could see they blamed me, even though they were too nice to say it aloud. Nathan and Bradley never discussed that evening, not to their parents, not to me, not to each other. However, the following fall, Nathan stopped participating in the school's wilderness club and began sleeping with his light on. The official report described Josh's 20-hour absence, the broken GPS and compass, and those precisely timed whistles that none of us could explain, as a case of momentary confusion that may have been brought on by mild heat exhaustion or dehydration. That July, I had a yard sale where I sold all of my camping equipment. I told folks that I couldn't keep up with hiking because I was too busy with work. In actuality, though, I can't even pass a forest without recalling those noises that reverberate through the trees. Josh claimed he never mastered the pattern, which was always precisely 17 minutes apart. When I ran into Josh's mother 6 months later at the grocery store, she pulled me aside by the frozen food area and told me something that made my knees almost give out. Her voice was hardly audible above a whisper. About a month after the incident, Josh began whistling in his sleep, following the identical melody we had heard in the woods. Additionally, during these episodes, he would sit up with his eyes wide open, but utterly distracted, continuing to whistle for precisely 17 minutes before going back down in the morning with no recollection of it. She had brought him to a neurologist at the university hospital, well as other doctors in Portland. However, all of the tests were normal. His brain showed no symptoms of damage or abnormalities, simply a 13-year-old boy who claimed he had never learned how to whistle a distress call. That winter, they relocated to California. Something about Josh's father getting a job. However, I was aware of the true cause. For the same reason, I had begun searching for accounting positions in areas that were remote from forests and mountains. Before rushing out with her cart, she told me one final time that Josh had ceased the whistling once they had passed the state line. Abruptly ceased, as if whatever was causing it was unable to follow them too far. All I could think about was Nathan still living 3 blocks away from me, and whether or not distance mattered to whatever we had faced in those woods. I wanted to be relieved for them. During what should have been a straightforward weekend camping trip 6 months ago, my husband Christopher and I made the decision to explore some northern Michigan backroads. At 32, Chris taught high school chemistry, and I worked remotely doing medical transcription. As a result, we frequently used our long weekends to escape the world and simply take a drive through the woods. By that time, we had been married for 4 years, and we used these little travels to spice things up, finding undiscovered waterfalls or deserted mining communities that weren't listed in any travel guides. It began like any other exploring day on that Saturday in early April. Trail mix in the console, coffee and thermoses, and Chris's vintage Jeep Cherokee packed with camping supplies in case we ended up spending the night somewhere. We were both in a terrific mood, singing along to the classic rock station until the signal faded into static. The morning had been gloomy, but by noon the sun was peeking through the trees, providing those lovely light shafts that photographers often pursue. We pulled onto a Forest Service road that appeared promising over 3 hours of driving, halfway between Grayling and Roscommon. Some roads just seem to be calling to you, particularly as they wind into deep pine forests where the sky is obscured by the canopy. As we continued on, the gravel crunched beneath our tires as we passed a few rusted mailboxes and hunting blinds that marked driveways that led into the woods, unlikely to old cabins or trailers where people went to vanish from the world. We had lost all bars about 20 minutes prior, which, to be honest, made it more exciting because we had no idea where this road would take us. We were just following its twists and turns through increasingly untamed landscape. Chris kept checking his phone for a GPS signal. Then we spotted the sign, black text and bright yellow, impossible to miss, though at one point it had been blasted up with buckshot, leaving tiny holes that allowed sunlight through like stars. The trail was closed, only authorized personnel. Violators will face legal action. However, the road beyond it seems to have been graded recently. There are new tire tracks in the ground. Chris then drummed his fingers on the steering wheel as he slowed the Jeep to a stop. The steering wheel, in the same manner that he always did when considering an action that we should probably avoid. Through the static, I could still hear the precise tune. Hotel California, and how Chris asked me if I wanted to see what was so amazing that they had to close the trail, with that boyish smile that still made my heart skip a beat even after all these years together. Chris has the ability to make any situation seem logical. In addition, the traces indicated a recent pass-through. If maintenance workers or anyone else continued to use the road on a regular basis, how dangerous might it actually be? Slowly, we sped past the sign, both of us looking around the trees as if a ranger could suddenly emerge and issue a ticket. However, all that was present was additional woodland, and that the road was recently maintained and wound through tall white pines that must have existed before Michigan was a state. We drove on this increasingly narrow road for about 10 minutes before we came to a hairpin bend and spotted it. At that point, I was going to recommend that we turn around since the trees were beginning to get so close that branches were scraping the sides of the Jeep. A tiny wooden building, perhaps 12 by 15 feet, with a green metal roof and a single window that was bright yellow despite the fact that it was just mid-afternoon. There was a white pickup truck parked directly outside, one of those government-looking vehicles with a light bar on top, but no real agency markings. We both assumed we had simply come across some sort of forestry service outpost where they likely housed equipment, handled paperwork, or did whatever else Forest Service employees do in their tiny shacks in the middle of nowhere, because the entire situation was so typical and unremarkable. After Chris parked behind the truck, we waited there for a while, wondering if we should turn around and head back before anyone noticed that we had disregarded the closed path sign, or knock and perhaps ask for instructions back to the main road, given that we had been roaming 4 hours. But, as always with us, curiosity prevailed. Chris added that since the owner of that truck was most likely inside completing paperwork, having lunch, or doing something else, we should at least say hello, perhaps apologize for being on the blocked road, and check to see if they had a map or anything. As soon as we were outside, we became aware of how silent everything was. The total lack of sound that makes your ears ring as if the entire forest was holding its breath is not your typical woodland silence, where you can still hear birds, squirrels, and the wind through the branches. It was one of those massive wooden doors with iron hardware that led to the shanty. Forest Service green paint that is peeling in spots to reveal worn wood underneath. In the disarming teacher accent he used to try to soothe irate parents at school conferences, Chris knocked 3 times, authoritative but polite, saying, "Hello, sorry to bother you." We could hear things coming from inside, but no one responded. A faint electrical hum, possibly from a space heater or a generator, and behind that, there was a steady creaking sound, either the building settling in the wind or someone rocking in an old chair. However, on that particular day, there was no wind. Chris pounded again, louder this time, and not surprisingly, when no one answered, he tried the handle locked. However, he then saw that the curtain on the window next to the entrance was only half drawn back, creating a space of perhaps 6 inches broad where the wooden deck was bathed in pleasant light. Using the global spouse language for "should I," he lifted his eyebrows as he looked at me. He moved over to stare through that opening before I could properly respond in either direction, putting his palms over his eyes to block off the afternoon sun's glare. His body language changed in real time, and I saw it. He leaned forward out of casual interest, then his shoulders suddenly stiffened, and then he jerked violently backward as if someone had grabbed his collar and pulled him away from the window, his face changing from its typical, healthy pink to this terrible grey colour had only ever seen once, during our honeymoon, when he had contracted food sickness from contaminated seafood. "We must depart," he declared, and he spoke. All wrong, tight and high, as if he were being strangled, and he took hold of my wrist with such force that it pained. Before I could even comprehend what was happening, they were already dragging me in the direction of the Jeep. I tried to find out what he had seen, but he was fumbling with the keys, so much that he dropped them twice before he was able to open the door. He kept saying, Now we need to leave now," under his breath like a mantra or prayer. His fear spread like wildfire. I couldn't figure out why I was rushing to the passenger side. As Chris smashed the key into the ignition with shaking fingers I leapt in and shut the door, my heart thumping against my ribs. When the Jeep sprang to life, he flung it in reverse so quickly that pebbles sprayed across the underside of the tires as they spun. And as he made the fastest three-point turn I had ever seen, I recall clutching the door handle until my knuckles became white. As he turned us around on that small route, the entire car lurched and fishtailed. With the exception of the engine's scream and the pebbles pinging off the chassis, we must have drove in total silence for 20 minutes. Chris is speeding through those wooded corners, causing branches to slam across the windshield and leave pine sap streaks behind. I could feel the muscles bouncing beneath his skin, his jaw clenched so tightly. He instantly pulled over, cut the engine, and simply sat there gasping like he'd run a marathon, his white-knuckled hands still holding the steering wheel even though we'd stopped moving. When we finally blew past the shot-up closure sign and onto the main forest road, in fact, he flinched when I lightly touched his shoulder. Chris, who would, never flinched at anything in the years I knew him. He had confronted hostile parents at school meetings without blinking, and he had rescued a neighbor's puppy from a freezing pond without hesitation. Chris, honey, what did you see in there? Even though every cell in my body was begging to find out what could have caused my solid, unwavering husband to behave in this way, I asked in a calm and gentle manner. I will always remember the look on his face when he turned to face me. There was more than simply terror. There was also this intense, visceral disgust. Not until long later did I realize it was shame, although I couldn't exactly place it. It was as if he had witnessed something so terrible that it had tainted him. There were finally, he mumbled, restraints, and the word came out broken, as if saying it caused him actual pain. The floor was fastened with metal shackles. They are grouped in a circle around this drain in four groupings. As if he had paused, his Adam's apple was bobbing in his throat as he swallowed forcefully. Additionally, there was new blood on the walls, still wet in some spots, rather than old, brown blood. Additionally, there are these customized, medical-looking tools hanging on a pegboard. Additionally, a tripod-mounted camera, one of those pricey digital cameras, with the red recording light still blinking, was aimed toward the handcuffs. His speech flowed more quickly, as if he had to speak before he lost the courage to speak, before his mind could fully comprehend what he was saying. Additionally, there were black contractor garbage bags in the corner. At least 6 of them were stacked and tied off. Additionally, something dark was dripping onto the floor, and the scent was coming from the window crack. God, like raw meat and copper pennies, and something sweeter than bleach. What he described wasn't even the worst part. That was the next step. We had just retreated from a closed trail when we heard an engine in the distance getting louder. It was coming from deeper in the forest. With his breath caught in his throat, Chris became rigid next to me. Without saying a word, he restarted the Jeep and retreated onto the road with a slow, regulated motions. They were trying to appear like to normal individuals on a normal drive who had not simply gone somewhere they shouldn't have been. But it was nothing like the frantic flight from before. About 2 miles down the road, we passed a dark blue vehicle that was traveling in the opposite direction, toward that shack, and I got a peek of the driver, a middle-aged man with spectacles and a baseball cap who seemed absolutely normal. The type of person you would never give any thought to if you saw them at any supermarket or petrol station. As the vehicle passed, I noticed Chris's hands tightening on the wheel, but he continued to look straight ahead, and as it slowed, I saw the red flare of its brake lights in my side mirror, perhaps simply negotiating the difficult path, or perhaps the motorist was also observing us, committing our license plate to memory, and wondered if we were the cause of his shack's door being ajar a little when he got there. Where we had parked was disrupted by the gravel. After leaving those woods at least 100 miles distant, we drove home for 4 hours straight without stopping, not even for petrol. Chris went straight to his laptop, and we arrived into our Sterling Heights driveway and spent hours reading Northern Michigan missing people reports, his face growing thinner with each one. 3 cases over the previous 18 months were discovered by him. Hikers who disappeared from the trails in the general vicinity. At trailheads, their vehicles were discovered, No indications of struggle. Simply vanished like if they had entered a forest and vanished into the mist. However, what actually ruined him? He saw a news article about a family of 4 whose RV had been discovered abandoned on a Forest Service road 2 weeks before to our trip, which caused him to shut off his laptop and head to the restroom, where I heard him throw up. All of their possessions, including phones and wallets, were unharmed, and their golden dog was still confined inside, barking at his horse. However, the family just disappeared. A picture of them during Christmas was featured in the article. Parents in their 30s, like us, to children with missing teeth. A typical, contented family you'd see at any weekend soccer match, school pickup line. And Chris continued to gaze at their faces until I escorted him to bed and carefully shut down the laptop. It was 6 months in the past, beyond what he told me that day in the Jeep. Chris still won't discuss it. Most of the time, they won't even admit it happened, although we never heard anything about it. I am aware that the next day, he used a payphone at a rest stop to provide the state police an anonymous report. I occasionally see him staring at nothing. I am aware that he is back there, peering through that window and witnessing things that have no place in a civilized society. The worst aspect is that we are both aware that that hut is still in use, that our tire tracks were discovered when the man in the blue van returned there, perhaps discovered where the dust on the window was disturbed by Chris's handprints, and there is someone out there who is aware that 2 people saw something that they shouldn't have. We have discussed moving somewhere far from Michigan, starting over. However, we both know it wouldn't make a difference. Something like that is impossible to unsee. You can't deny the existence of such sites, concealed under closing signs that the majority of people respect, functioning in areas where no one is inclined to search, in a place where the song of woodland swallows is audible and deserted roads lead to nightmares, disguised as maintenance shacks that are still lit and waiting for inquisitive couples who ought to have continued driving. It took place someplace up north during a school field trip to a state park, because the trees had not yet fully grown their leaves and the night air was still crisp. I recall that it was early April. Our students had camped out by a peaceful lake, the kind that, when all else is quiet, reflects the moon like a sheet of glass. At the time, I was 16 years old and living in a tent with Eli and Marcus, my 2 best friends. When lights out arrived, slipping away felt more like a challenge than a bad idea, because the 3 of us weren't exactly the rule followers. We unzipped the tent as silently as possible, waiting for the teacher's flashlight to cease scouring the campground. We were surprised by how dark the night was. No distant traffic, no city glow, just the slight rustle of wind against the branches and the deep black of the forest. Eli had taken from home a cheap flashlight that flickered when you tapped it too hard. I recall thinking it was absurd that we were whispering to each other when no one else could hear. But we were naturally quieter because of the silence. Behind the ranger's cottage, the route began as a narrow dirt walk with antiquated wooden signs that were unreadable in the dark. Nevertheless, we followed it, going past an ancient fire pit encircled by broken glass and partially buried beer cans. It was thrilling at first, the kind of rush you get when you feel untouchable even though you know you're breaking the laws. It felt more like trespassing into a place that didn't want us the further we walked, though, and less like adventure. Marcus' headlamp spotted something ahead after around 20 minutes. There was a person in the center of the walkway. We initially believed that one of the teachers had apprehended us, but there was something strange about the way he stood. He was standing facing our direction, clutching something in his right hand that glinted in the sun, and he wasn't even changing his weight. It appeared to be a long knife, possibly a hunting knife. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke, with the exception of the subtle hum of Eli's quivering breath and the buzzing of insects. The woods surrounding us were completely still. Eli muttered that we should turn around, but before any of us could do so, the man cocked his head, as if he wanted a better view of us through the darkness. The slightest movement was enough to startle me. He didn't move forward, didn't say anything, and didn't even lift the knife. He simply cocked his head more, and our flashlight's reflection struck his face, appearing almost painted on, pale, expressionless, and still. Slowly, so as not to crush the leaves beneath our feet, we retreated. The route behind us appeared different when we eventually turned to return to camp, as if the woodland had changed, while we were not looking. In an attempt to locate the shattered fire pit we had passed earlier, we moved more quickly and whispered to one another where the path markers were. The limbs of the trees leaned over us like arms, and they appeared denser now. Eli would occasionally swing his flashlight back, catching glimmers of something in the glare, perhaps a branch, or simply our own shadows. Marcus, however, claimed to have seen movement. He was once more standing a few yards away when he shone his light behind us. The same stance, the same knife dangling at his side. He was neither hiding nor running. He simply stood there, observing the light from our flashlights, as though he was waiting for us to move. Eli eventually let his flashlight fall to the ground, and as it did, the light rolled to face the trees to the left. At that moment, we noticed a second, smaller figure crouching close to a tree's base. Until it straightened up, we initially believed it to be an animal. Someone else was involved. They were facing us, both of them still, and I was unable to hear anything at that time. Not even our own breathing. No wind, no crickets. The entire woodland seemed to be with us. It held its breath. The two figures then slowly retreated into the shadows and vanished, as though they had already decided on it. We stopped bothering to whisper. We simply ran. With each stride, the air felt heavier, roots snagged our feet, and branches scraped at our faces, until we eventually noticed the drab orange light from the flame flickering through the woods. None of us said anything. Covered in mud and struggling to breathe, we staggered back into camp, trying to convince ourselves that we hadn't actually seen what we believed we had. We turned off the flashlights and zipped the tent shut, but none of us were able to fall asleep. I had the impression that they were once more waiting for our light to move whenever the wind blew against the tent or something broke outside. It seemed strange when daylight arrived, as if the forest had chosen to act as though nothing had happened. Since we sneaked out, the teachers reprimanded us, but I honestly didn't hear them. In the daytime, everything appeared innocuous. The trees appeared normal, and the trail appeared narrower. The route we followed last night didn't even appear to exist anymore. When we attempted to retrace our steps with the group later that day, there was no clearing, no fire pit, and no indication of people. Marcus and I knew exactly where we'd walked, but Eli insisted we'd just turned around. Something like that is not something you forget. I couldn't take my eyes off the tree iron outside the tents that night. Every shadow seemed to represent a person standing just beyond the campfire's grasp. I swear I heard slow, methodical footsteps around the camp through the brush as the wind came up. The thought of unzipping the tent once more made my chest constrict, but I wanted to wake someone up. I waited for the noise to end while I laid there looking at the fabric. When fatigue finally prevailed, I slept poorly and had weird dreams. Voices murmuring my name, a blade catching moonlight, and pale faces amid the trees. The following morning's bus travel home was uneventful, even when the teachers questioned us about why we appeared to have not slept. None of us discussed what had transpired. Saying it out seems to bring it back to reality. Marcus informed me a few weeks later that one weekend his father had brought him back to the park for a hike. According to him, the ranger they spoke with indicated that other tourists have seen weird individuals on the trails at night, standing motionless and never talking. The ranger dismissed it as hunters or pranksters, but Marcus claimed the man appeared uncomfortable when he said it, as if he knew more than he was prepared to acknowledge. Since then, I haven't gone camping. Those two figures continue to occupy my thoughts. How they walked in complete quiet. How our flashlights had to be on them for them to appear. I sometimes think about what may have occurred if we hadn't turned around at that precise moment when I can't sleep. If our lights had gone out entirely, or if we had continued to walk, they might have disappeared, or perhaps they would have approached. In any case, I always remember that night in the park, when I walk close to the woods at night and see a reflection between the trees, and I turn around before the light changes. I've always found that hiking keeps me sane, and I reside in a little town close to the national forest. That spring, my partner and I had spent every weekend exploring various trails in an effort to locate peaceful spots away from the crowds. We chose a trail that morning that we had never used before, one that led up to a picturesque overlook that many online have called wonderful. It was a quiet drive there. The sky appeared to be heavy with rain, yet it never broke, and there were miles of verdant hills with sporadic homes. We stopped close to a small dirt road where a faded sign, with nearly all of its paint gone, stood barely erect. It seemed to be one of those locations where the natural world had begun to reclaim the structures that people had constructed. The hike was quiet in the beginning. We heard the sound of a stream for a long time until it faded into silence, and the air had the scent of damp pine, as if to say, "See, this was worth it." My boyfriend Aaron would occasionally turn to smile at me while walking a few paces ahead. We discussed grabbing sandwiches afterwards and possibly inviting others the following time. It was a distinct kind of silence, almost emotionless, dense yet not dangerous. I recall thinking how uncommon it was to be in such an unspoiled area, where the only sound was the patter of our boots on the ground. After an hour or so, we noticed a truck parked close to a clearing, a little off the track. Appeared strange, older, possibly from covered in dried mud in the 1990s. One man in a tan outfit came out. It appeared to be a park ranger's uniform at first, but the color was faded, and there were large scratches all over the badge on his chest, as if someone had attempted to scrape it off. Instead than waving at us in a welcoming manner, he seemed to be telling us to stop. He remarked, "You just shouldn't go any further," in a tight, clipped voice. Beyond the ridge, there has been bear activity. Although Aaron praised him, I found a couple things off kilter. Not even temporary tags or registration plates were present on the truck. It appeared to have been hit by something because of the dents along the side, and the man only had a little black bag slung over one shoulder. He had no radio or other equipment. His eyes lingered too long, darting between us as if assessing us, yet his expression was unreadable. This time, he reiterated with greater firmness that we must immediately turn around. The man did not respond when Aaron inquired as to whether the trail was formally closed. As if we were kids ignoring him, he simply repeated the admonition louder. Aaron wanted to continue walking, but I didn't like the tone of that man. The words alone weren't enough. He stated these without showing any signs of worrying. He seemed like he was reciting a script. It was almost forced. He only indicated the trailhead from where we had come when I inquired which way we should go to return safely. When he did, his face remained perfectly motionless, but his hand shook slightly. I felt as though we were prying into someone's personal space during the ensuing hush. Aaron gave me a brief thank you and started to go, and I followed him, turning to look back once. The man was still standing, with his head slightly cocked to one side. He watched us from the side of his truck. After that, we strolled in quiet for some time. Now the woodland felt different. The wind and trees were the same, yet something felt heavier, as if the air had thickened. I cringed at every sound. Birds chirping, branches breaking, and the crunch of gravel beneath our feet. Aaron chuckled quietly after 10 or 15 minutes, saying, "Maybe the guy was just being overly cautious," but he didn't sound convinced. He pretended to be merely taking in the scenery, while he continued to peek behind us. He thought he heard an engine in the distance at one point, but when we listened, we couldn't hear it. Only the slight sound of leaves rustling. I turned to look for the clearing where the vehicle had been when we got to the car, but I couldn't see anything. Not even a patch of flattened grass, no broken limbs, no tire imprints. The area appeared pristine, as if no car had ever been parked there. For a while, we tried to laugh it off while sitting in the car. Aaron turned the key, but not before locking the doors. It felt like it took longer to travel down the dirt road. I recall half expecting to see that same truck behind us as I looked out the window. It wasn't until we were back on the main road and the cell signal came back that we spoke again. We went to the ranger office beside the park entrance later that afternoon to report the incident. The female receptionist, when I explained the man's uniform, he appeared perplexed. After looking at a clipboard, she called someone in the rear. An older ranger with a severe expression emerged a few minutes later and requested us to repeat everything. The man's face shifted when Aaron brought up the missing license plates. According to him, a hiker went missing close to the overlook last week, which is why that section of the route was blocked, and there were no rangers assigned to that area today. While he made another call, the ranger urged us to wait. He briefly went outside, and I could see him pacing close to a line of cars through the glass. His tone had changed by the time he returned. He said, earlier that morning, they had dispatched someone to investigate that path. Another ranger who had discovered nothing out of the ordinary. After a pause, he added that a number of guests had reported hearing a truck engine in the woods in recent days, but none of them had seen the driver. In case you recall anything else, he said, please call. He slid a yellow sticky note across the counter and put his number on it, somewhere in a drawer. I still have it. I kept playing again the scene where the man indicated the trailhead that night, the blank expression in his eyes and the way his hand shook. I made an effort to convince myself that he might have been a volunteer or someone feigning assistance. However, why is the badge scratched? Why are the plates missing? Aaron explained that the important thing was that we were safe and that it was better not to think about it. But that night, half expecting to hear a car idling outside, I left the light on in the living room. Aaron returned to the internet a few days later to learn about the hiker who had gone missing. The last person seen climbing the same overlook trail was a young man in his 20s. He never returned to his vehicle. According to the newspaper, search teams only discovered a ripped piece of uniform cloth close to a dry stream bed, close enough to confuse someone from a distance, but not a part problem. That particular element stuck with me. After that, I took a break from hiking. My chest tightened at the thought of going for a walk in the woods. Years have passed since that day. However, I find myself slowing down to look at the license plates whenever I see a ranger truck on the side of the road. There's a part of me that wishes we had met someone harmless. Perhaps there was simply a crazy individual out there. However, there is another, more subdued, side that questions whether the hiker's disappearance was caused by the man we encountered, and whether the only thing preventing us from joining him was our decision to turn around at that moment. It began when I made the decision to go to the flea market close to the former train depot on an unusually quiet weekend. Finding anything old always appealed to me, even if I had been saving for a new lens. Every vendor seemed to have a story to tell, and the air had a smell of metal polish and ancient wood. I saw it at that moment. A black DSLR that seemed like it had seen a lot of use was resting on a faded red tablecloth. It belonged to a traveler who never returned for it. According to the vendor, an elderly man with tan skin and a crooked wedding band. I didn't ask for extra because the price was too excellent to refuse. I cleaned the dust off when I got home and looked inside the battery compartment. There was a little, ancient-looking memory card inside, hidden under the clasp. I inserted it into my laptop out of habit to check what was on it. Slowly, hundreds of pictures loaded. I immediately recognized a group of 6 hikers grinning in front of a wooded route. I had visited my town numerous times to take sunrise photos, and it was just a few miles away. Before I discovered something odd, the pictures appeared to be typical, full of motion blur and laughter. In the latter ones, a dark figure emerged between the trees, well behind the group. The same person appeared in each frame, although it was dark, hazy, and a little closer than previously. There was no sign of a hiker. Its head was slanted in one photo in an unnatural way. Its posture was a little slumped, and its contour was excessively long. I tried zooming closer, but before I could see any features, the pixels broke apart. I felt a mixture of interest and uneasiness constrict my chest. Perhaps they were being followed, or perhaps it was a trick of the light. In any case, I felt as though I was prying into someone's personal space. I should have simply erased the data at that moment, but my curiosity always gets the better of me. In order to duplicate the images for comparison, I made the decision to return to the same trail the following day. I packed my camera and headed out early in the morning. Over the fields, the fog is still low. The woodland was eerily silent, and the air was cooler than I had anticipated. There was only the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, no birds, no wind. Trying to align the identical trees and rocks from the pictures, I opened the pictures on my phone and began matching the angles one by one. Everything had the same appearance, but the forest seemed to be holding its breath because it felt heavier in some way. The light had begun to shift by the time I arrived at the location where the hikers had taken their final pictures. The moss on the rocks was painted with a soft green glow as the sun's rays seeped through the branches in thin streaks. I snapped a few pictures, checked my screen, changed the focus, and then took some more. Trees, a patch of fog, and my tripod standing alone in the clearing, nothing out of the ordinary. I lingered for a short while longer, almost expecting to hear laughter or footsteps resonating outside the woods. But the forest was motionless. It seemed to be anticipating my departure. I spent some time going through the photos after returning to my car. I kept thinking about that fuzzy figure, even though the forest seemed beautiful. The radio crackled with static before the song started, and my hands were cold when I pressed the key. However, the drive home went without incident. I noticed that I was looking at the rearview mirror more frequently than normal, as if I gazed long enough, something may appear in the back seat. Even though my voice sounded little in the silent car, I brushed it off and told myself I was being silly. After making tea that evening, I opened my laptop and compared the old and current pictures. I placed them side by side on the screen and gently went through each one. The distant fog patch, the rock formation, and the tree line are all the same. Then something new showed up in the fifth picture. Behind the tree line, exactly where I had been standing, there was a faint silhouette close to the frame's edge. I zoomed in, leaning closer. It was hardly perceptible, yet it appeared to be a human. Like heat rising off asphalt, the shape was slightly warped. I looked at one picture, then another. The guy was standing behind a group of trees. Closer this time, it was more distinct in the following one. Not only a shadow or a trick of the light. A tall, slender individual dressed in dark clothing. Trying to convince myself that it was someone who had been trekking close by, I pushed away from the desk. However, the angle was illogical. They were always behind me, at a distance that, had someone else been present, should have been apparent. That night, sleep was difficult. In my apartment, every sound seemed to be exaggerated. The subtle creak of the pipes, the hum of the refrigerator, and even the slight buzz of the streetlights outside. I repeatedly promised myself that I would review the pictures in the morning and perhaps forward them to an editing-savvy buddy. However, my curiosity overcame me. I restarted the laptop at midnight, my heart pounding as the screen sprang to life. I took the final picture of the day, right before I left the trail, and I clicked it. Once more, the figure was clearly seen, standing a few feet behind me. I sat still, gazing at the picture. The black object in the picture appeared to mix with my reflection on the screen, as if it were peering through me. I had a dry mouth. I didn't remember shooting the next picture, so I opened it. It was a distant view of my car, with the trunk slightly open. Then another, of my apartment building, seen from the other side of the street, with a faint illumination coming from my window. When I learned these pictures weren't mine, I felt heavy. They were more recent. Only a few hours had passed since the timestamps were taken. I closed my laptop and unplugged the camera, pacing the room while each shadow appeared to change. I sat in the corner of the room with the lights on, checked the door locks again, and drew the curtains. My phone vibrated at around 3 in the morning, alerting me to a message from an unidentified number. There was only one picture in it. My living room, with the same light on, and at the same angle as where I was seated, but without me in the photo. A week later, I sold all of my cameras and moved out. I still take photos for business, but now I solely use my phone. When I reported it, the police never discovered anything, and I ceased attempting to explain everything. Someone informed me that it was a prank after the third time. Occasionally, however, a random photograph that I know I did not capture will appear when I browse through old files or cloud backups. The background is the same light outline, a bit closer than before, always, closer than before, always.